Education and Early Learning's presentation on free appropriate public education, or what we call FAPE, and compensatory education. We are excited today to talk to you about a resource that KDE has developed to assist admissions and release committees in conversations about compensatory education. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to put those into the Q&A box. And at the end of the presentation, we will take some time to answer any questions that are in that chat. My name is Sylvia Starkey. I'm the director of the Division of IDEA Monitoring and Results. And with me today, I also have Veronica Sullivan and Rhonda Logston. And so I'm going to give them just a minute to introduce themselves before we get started.
Hi, I'm so grateful to be with you all today, and so excited about this and us all partnering together. I'm Rhonda Logston with Kentucky SPIN, and I'm the executive director, and it's Kentucky Special Parent Involvement Network, and we are the Parent Training and Information Project for the state of Kentucky and have been since Kentucky first received one since 1988. First and foremost, though, I am a sister. 3 of my siblings have disabilities. My twin sister had a severe learning disability and as an adult was diagnosed bipolar. She's my special angel in heaven now. Then my middle brother, who's the only one without a twin, and he is a fiery redhead. So if you have ever met Grant, you will know that. Grant just happens to use a wheelchair, and the youngest of the twins, my brother, has ADHD. Each have unique experiences that come with that, from the seen to the unseen disability, but all are smarter than I could wish to be, and they keep me on track. So before I hand it over to Veronica here, I just want you to know we're here to help. And our first goal is building partnerships, because in the end, that is what helps our children do the very best. And so I'm very grateful to be with you today. So Veronica, take it away.
Thank you, Rhonda. And we're so excited to have you partner with us and collaborate on this work. Your family perspective is going to just strengthen the support for students across the Commonwealth. I'm Veronica Sullivan. I am the division director of the Division of IDEA Implementation and Preschool at KDE. And we're really excited about today's presentation. Next slide. So before we get into the materials, we just want to go over the background and the why this resource was developed for districts. The first reason is really to support ARCs with individual discussions around compensatory education. It can be a bit tricky sometimes, and we really want to provide all ARC members with a resource to help support and facilitate those conversations. Part of that facilitation strength is deepening an understanding of free appropriate public education, or FAPE. Another piece of that is ensuring that parents and families have the tools to actively engage in ARC discussions regarding compensatory education. And finally, to provide accessible and sustainable resources for all ARC members, not only now, but in the future. Next slide.
So the first section of the document that we're going to talk to you about today is titled Guidance for All ARC Members. And so I'm going to talk you through that part of the document and answer any questions that you may have. Next slide, please. The first question is really, what is a free and appropriate public education? And the Kentucky Administrative Regulations define FAPE as special education and related services that are provided at public expense, under public supervision and direction, and without charge, that meet the standards of the KDE that are included in other parts of the Kentucky Administrative Regulations that include preschool, elementary school, or secondary school education in the state, and that are provided in conformity with an individual education program that meets the requirements of 707 KAR 1320, which is the section about IEPs. Next slide, please. And so it's really important for districts to remember that regardless of the instructional delivery model, whether you were in person or in a hybrid model, or if you were fully virtual, no matter what, that local school districts still do continue to be responsible for providing FAPEs to students with disabilities. And whenever that those special education related services are not provided in accordance with an IEP, regardless of the reason why, if you're unable to provide FAPE for unavoidable reasons, the only remedy for being able to fix that is compensatory education. So the idea of compensatory education is really not to put blame on anyone, whether it's the district or the parent or whatever. It's just really to put kids in positions and pay back the things that maybe we weren't able to provide due to COVID-19. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that during COVID-19, there were some districts who were unable to provide FAPE for unavoidable reasons. IEPs may have been impossible to implement as they were written, given the situation and everything that was going on. And so we'll talk a little bit about what compensatory education is next. It's really not defined in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or what we call the IDEA. And so you won't find compensatory education in the KARs. You won't find it with the federal regulations either. It's really shaped by case law. And so it's really designed to protect the entitlement of students with disabilities. And so there's a very, popular case called Reed versus the District of Columbia that really talks to us about what the purpose of compensatory education is really to be. And that case really says that compensatory awards should aim to place disabled children in the same position that they would have otherwise occupied, but for the school district's violation of the IDEA. And so that's what we're trying to do here, is really just to place kids back in the same position that they would have been had we been able to provide everything in COVID-19 that we were able to provide in a regular school year. Next slide. And so you will also see us talk about, when people discuss compensatory education, there's a lot of terminology that some people will use. KDE really encourages districts to use the words compensatory education because all of those different type terminologies really come back to compensatory education. And so you might hear it called unfinished learning or lost learning or post-COVID instruction, or there's several other terms that may be used. And just, remember that when you're having those conversations, it's just really important for us to remember that it's important to acknowledge that any services that are designed to place a student in a place that they would have otherwise been, but for a denial of FAPE, those are indeed compensatory education services. So if you're not comfortable using that language, that's okay, but just know that it still is compensatory education, however you use whatever terminology you use. So the first thing we're going to talk about when we're discussing how to decide compensatory education, next slide, is the role of the admissions and release committees. And so it's important to remember that ARCs have to review. So ARCs have to review the status of special education and related services. They have to review the ongoing progress monitoring, and they have to determine on a case-by-case basis whether compensatory education is owed to a student. It's really important to remember that it has to be case-by-case, and that each ARC individually has to determine whether or not compensatory education is relevant for each student with a disability. And if so, it is, then the ARC is also tasked with determining the logistics of that compensatory education. And so next slide, Rhonda, I'm going to let you talk just a little bit about parental input during the ARC.
Yes, it is so important because we as parents or family members know our child better than anyone does. And this is no exception when we're looking at this, and especially when we're talking about during COVID, because the whole situation has created, parents are going to have more information than others might, but always they have important things to bring to the table, and making sure that everyone has all of the same information and shares that, and really what we can do, because there's going to be a lot of data that they may have that typically the schools may have had, just given the situation that we're in right now with the pandemic. So first and foremost, making sure that everybody, regardless of COVID or not, how we can build that partnership so that parents are an equal member of the team and are able to have the information they need so that they can do their best and being able to help their child. So any steps that they could be taken to help that, I think, will only grow the partnership better, that in the end is going to help our children. So Sylvia, I know you were going to talk about some others on parent input.
So it's just, again, I'd like to, talk about exactly what Rhonda said, is that parents are really critical members of the ARC, particularly in the time of COVID. Parents have all kinds of information that can be gained from the student's home experience and what was going on during COVID-19 and how that went for the student at home. And so we want to make sure that we're, including them as equal members. When you're looking at these things, you're going to be wanting to look at things like parental input. Professional judgment is super important. When you're sending meeting notices to parents to discuss compensatory education, it's really important that you specify that you're going to be talking about compensatory education within your meeting notice. Now, we know that meeting notices don't have a box for us to check that says compensatory education, because that's not something that's typically handled on a regular basis. It is, and the best way to do that is to check the other box on the meeting notice and then type in to discuss compensatory education. And so that's a way to let parents know ahead of time so they can prepare for the conversation. And then, we just would encourage every district to consider explaining compensatory education to parents first. So it's really important to remember that not every parent has specialized knowledge regarding compensatory education. So it's going to be really important for you to slow down just a little bit and think about how can you provide that information to parents so that they can participate meaningfully. So can you discuss what compensatory education is at the beginning of the meeting before you get into any data regarding the student? So, one of the recommendations would just be think through, here's what compensatory education is, here's the
Well, and I think we've got a little bit of technical issues, but I'm going to chime right in here because I know Sylvia, it must be, and what I tell everybody is, if I'm associated with it, you can guarantee there's going to be some technical issues. So one other thing I wanted to mention before we head it back over to Sylvia is that, and just as she was saying, make sure in the beginning of the meeting that you talk about what compensatory education is and explain it. Another thing that's critical, I think, too, any opportunity prior to that meeting to take place, because just as I do better when I'm more prepared. And some things, because this is so detailed, to be able to understand all of this, you need time to digest it, right? Because we're all figuring this out as we go. COVID has taught us that much. So if we take those opportunities to, even prior to the meeting, to help one another, I think we're all going to be better. And any data, though, that you might be going over, any opportunity that we can share that prior, then we all come to the table prepared and ready to go. And I think we're going to hand it back over to Sylvia now, but I just wanted to chime in on that. Sylvia, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, awesome.
Perfect. Okay, sorry about losing sound on you there. I saw that happening and had a moment. So just remember, to really talk about what types of data you're going to talk about before you talk about what the data says, and then any type of thing that could be concerning should you see it when you review the data. So here's the type of data we're going to look at. Here's some things that we would consider concerning if we saw it. Okay, now that we know what we're going to talk about, let's go into the conversation about your specific student. And that would just really give parents a better footing and a best practice for how we can engage to make sure that parents are able to meaningfully participate in conversations about compensatory education for their student. And then just also remember that parents must be able to voice their concerns and provide any information about their child's response to non-traditional instruction or NTI. And just as a little tip, just make sure that you're scheduling any type of parent-requested ARCs for compensatory education promptly. However, if there's a student who maybe isn't necessarily, their parent hasn't called you and asked you, it's okay to wait until their annual review if you're able to, but if not, then that's okay too. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about case law. So we're going to talk about some important cases that will help you to really get through compensatory education discussion. So it's important to have a little bit of a working knowledge of case law, including the 3 below cases. So the first one is lovingly referred to as Rowley. And then the next one is Deal versus Hamilton. And the final one we'll talk about is the injury case that most people are pretty familiar with. So beginning with the Deal versus Hamilton case in the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals, the FAPE standard was set to confer meaningful educational benefit in Kentucky to all students with disabilities. And when the Supreme Court handled the injury decision, they actually heightened that standard for FAPE. And asked for ARCs to construct IEPs that are reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress that is appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So if you haven't reviewed those, that injury case, I'd really, encourage you to do it. But then what happens in injury is it actually points back to the Rowley case to explain how to determine whether a denial of FAPE has occurred. Next slide. So in Rowley, when you really read into Rowley, Rowley discusses a 2-part FAPE test that is critical to determine whether or not a denial of FAPE has occurred. And remember, compensatory education, the point of it is to remedy a denial of FAPE. And so first we have to know, did a denial of FAPE occur? So the first question in that 2-part FAPE test asks, has the district complied with the procedures that are set forth in the IDEA? And so it asks really, were there any procedural violations? Was there any time that you weren't able to provide services in the way that the IEP said that you were supposed to? And the point of that question is really not to place blame on anyone. It's not to place blame on the district to say, hey, we messed this up. It's really just to get through what was provided and what should have been provided based on the IEP. So if you have compensatory education logs, or you have the logs of, if you're a DoSE and you have logs of what the student was and wasn't provided during COVID-19, that's really going to help you to answer this first question. So, and remember that the threshold for this is 1, right? So if there was any one time that you, were unable to provide something that you were supposed to, then the answer to that question would be no. So you want to make sure that you're always kind of looking at those things. And then the second question is a little bit more complex. And it really talks about, was the IEP reasonably calculated and did it enable the student to receive educational benefits? So just because the answer to the first one is no, does not automatically mean that a student is provided compensatory education. It's important to remember that you have to look at both parts of that FAPE test. And so did we not provide something that we were supposed to provide? Yeah, we didn't provide that. Okay, now, in spite of that, did the student still receive FAPE is what you're trying to get at. And so that question really asks us to look at a review of data. Next slide. And so this is just kind of a screenshot of some of the things that you might consider when you're reviewing data. The intent of this is really not to be exhaustive. So if you have other information available to you, we would totally encourage you to look at whatever it is. Now, it's important for us to really take a minute here to discuss the differences between compensatory education and extended school year services, or ESY. So take really good care not to confuse the two. It's very easy to do. And some of the things that you're going to look at are going to, could potentially confuse you. And so it's really important to think about things like parental input, the student's current IEP, all of the documentation of special education or related services that were and that were not able to be provided to the student during COVID-19. And then you're also going to want to look at things like their grades and their work samples and their attendance logs and their progress monitoring towards their IEP goals. And you're going to want to look at those from before, during, and after NTI. Now, the important thing to remember is we're really not looking at regression when we're discussing compensatory education. We know that nearly all students are going to regress as part of the pandemic, and so that's something that we are going to handle through discussions of extended school year services. And so compensatory education is really for us to remedy whatever wasn't provided in the past. ESY is for us to prevent regression in the future. So it's important for us to kind of remember the differences. And so when you're looking at data, you're going to want to look at, when I'm looking at their progress monitoring, do I see a trend line where I'm just going to make up numbers? Let's say they were, gaining progress by about 2 points every session. When we went into NTI, did that significantly drop, but then maybe we came back to in-person services later and they shot right back up? That would indicate that there was some sort of denial of FAPE happening in the middle, but it might not, and it's going to depend on every individual kid. And so I think you hear me say all the time that it depends, and I think that's really relevant in this second question because every answer for every different kid is going to be completely different. And then you're also going to look at things like evaluation and reevaluation deadlines. Was there any amount of time that was expended? So do you owe the student services because maybe they missed their evaluation deadline by 4 or 5 days? And so if that was the case, then do you still owe the time for those 4 or 5 days that they would have otherwise had special education had their evaluation been done on time? And so that will be there. And it's really going to be important when you're reviewing data to discuss things like equity and access. So did the student have an equal opportunity for participation during NTI? Were there any barriers that hindered the student's access? What did the ARC do to mitigate those in the district? What did you do to mitigate those barriers? And so were you able to fix them later, or were they still problematic the whole time? And then just think about, the rate of progress between, long-term NTI and all of those things. Next slide.
Well, and I think too on it with the data, it's important to remember too that there might be some, because you might have a situation, and very likely that there would be more than one IEP that covered during COVID. So it's not only important to look at the current IEP, but make sure everybody has access and understanding, and are really looking at throughout COVID. So it might be, because annual reviews have happened since this all began. So you're going to need to make sure you take those things into consideration too, and helping the families, making sure they have access to it and prior, so that they can make informed decisions and give valuable input into the meeting and where their child is at.
Yeah, so a lot of this other stuff we have already discussed, but think about those rate of progresses. Were they able to maintain a similar rate of progress during NTI? Was there a noticeable difference in progress when they returned to in-person instruction, even if it was in small groups? And was there a correlation between that increase in progress and a barrier to learning, which was unable to be safely mitigated during COVID and NTI? Next slide. And so once you determine, yes, we think this student is eligible for compensatory education or is needing compensatory education to make up for any learning loss that happened, how you determine minutes, there's 2 different ways. And again, it's going to depend on the student which one is most appropriate. So there is a quantitative approach or a minute per minute approach. And in that approach, it really just is exactly what it says. So if you missed a 90-minute session, then you pay it back at 90 minutes, exactly what it was. It's very easy to calculate. And so that's one way that you can go about it, but it's not the only way, and it's not required that you always go about it quantitative or appropriate. Another approach is a qualitative approach. And so that's really determined by the effect of the loss of the educational benefit based on that student's unique situation. And so in that approach, the ARC has to determine what the benefit to the student would have been had they been provided those services. So where do we think the student would have otherwise been? An easy way to do this, and I'm going to give you a really basic example, is to be thinking about it in a skills-based approach. And so you're thinking through, okay, well, we think that this kindergarten student who is currently able to count to 5, let's say we had anticipated that given the information that they would have been able to count to 30. And so in those qualitative approaches, then you can do things like saying, okay, well, we think that once we'll provide compensatory education until the student is able to count to 30. Now, that is not the only way that you can go about the qualitative approach. There's very differing ways that you can go about the qualitative approach. And it's really up to what is the benefit that the student would have received. So there's lots of different ways you can go about that. But when you're doing those, it's important to make a decision on what the case by case, what the best approach is for that particular student. And to document how you came to that decision, right? So if you are calculating anything in a qualitative approach, you're really going to want to purse out in the conference summary how you came to the decision of what that benefit was, and exactly how you know when you're going to be finished with the thing. So how did you calculate the number of minutes that you're going to provide, and how do you know when you're finished? And so those things will be things. And then just remember that it would be, a uniform or a fixed approach is inappropriate. So it wouldn't be appropriate to say our whole district is going to do quantitative or our whole district is going to do qualitative. That decision is really best left to ARCs to determine what the best approach for. Next slide. And then additionally, there's all kinds of logistical considerations that need to kind of be addressed by the ARC and things that you need to discuss. So the first one of those things is documentation. And so one of the most frequent questions I get is, where do we put all of this information? Because there's a lot of conversations that have to happen. And the answer to that question is you put it in the conference summary. So you don't want to put information about compensatory education within the student's IEP. All of that goes in the conference summary where you discussed it. And so you will want to document everything. This is not a time to really summarize. I'd really put everything in there. You really want to talk about all of the things that you decided you are going to provide. Anything that someone wanted you to provide that maybe you decided against and why you decided against it. Any other approaches that you discussed during the meeting. So if you're talking about, 2 or 3 different things, make sure that you're documenting that you talked about them and why you decided, either to do it or not to do it either way. And that way you have every information that you need in there to be able to provide information, later down the road. Everybody will know why. And then you're also going to want to talk to things about scheduling meetings. And so when we're scheduling meetings, it is okay to do those at annual reviews. However, you're going to want to quickly schedule any meetings for things like parent requests or students who may have had a more significant challenge during NTI. And so those things will be, it's okay to prioritize students who maybe had more significant challenges that you want to really get to quicker. That's okay. But it's also okay to, discuss compensatory education during annual reviews if that's appropriate. And you'll have to decide those things kind of case by case. As far as attendance, you're going to want to make sure that you are discussing kind of taking attendance when students are coming to compensatory education, and that you're tracking all of those things and, the reasons why. When you're scheduling compensatory education sessions, you're going to want to consider what content is, as an ARC, to consider the content that is going to be covered in that session, who is going to provide it, where and how frequently that those services will occur. And then just remembering that, specially designed instruction has to be provided by a special education teacher, and that any related services must be provided by appropriately certified school staff. Or contract service providers or private service providers, and that they have to occur outside of the typical instructional day. So they can be held before or after school or during school breaks or anything like that, and that you should be keeping ongoing progress monitoring during those times. So just make sure you're keeping up with it and being really specific on the types of things that you're going to cover in those sessions. And then just remember that, districts can contract with outside providers. However, that's not required, but it may assist districts if they're, set with staffing difficulties. If you were to contract with outside providers, it's going to be really important for the district to remember that to develop some internal processes for how to ensure that the contracted services are paid timely and things like that. And then just remembering in terms of transportation, that the district must offer transportation for all students who receive compensatory education. You may reimburse parents for the expenses that are incurred, and that can be done through a mileage reimbursement rate. And there's more information in the document about how to provide mileage reimbursement and things like that. Or, you can provide it on a bus. And then just remembering financial considerations. You guys are great about this, but just remembering that cost can't be a determining factor when you're deciding whether or not a student needs compensatory education, and that the district assumes all costs associated with providing that. Districts may consider reserving a portion of their ESSER funding to help pay for compensatory education services. And then in terms of things like class size, it's important to remember, that there's lots of different ways that you can provide compensatory education. You can do it in a one-to-one setting or in a small group or a class. And it's just going to be important to remember that class sizes for compensatory education can't exceed a traditional class size requirements, and that we won't be looking at waivers for compensatory education, so those won't be considered. And then preschool students, sessions for preschool students can't exceed a class size of 20. And then the last logistic that we're really going to discuss is school-wide opportunities. And so, many school districts have designed authentic, engaging, remedial education opportunities to assist all students who suffered from lost learning opportunities or regression of skills during the pandemic. And it's critical to remember that students with disabilities are general education students first, and that they're entitled to those same exact opportunities. And so they're also entitled to the services that are on their IEPs. So it would be inappropriate to use a recovery program that was designed for all students to fulfill compensatory education minutes. General services that are provided to all students really can't take the place of required compensatory education services that are required by the ARC. Next slide. And so the next, I'm going to talk you through a couple of resources that were also designed to assist the districts in an ARC in having conversations around compensatory education. Next slide. So the first thing, and this is only half of the document on this screenshot, but it's really just designed to help you determine what kinds of questions can we ask when we're in an admissions and release committee to help us get to the answers to the first and second questions on that two-part FAPE test. So, what happened before COVID? What happened during NTI? What happened when we returned to in-person instruction? How do we, there's some questions for how to determine compensatory education services, and then also logistical, considerations that districts and parents can consider when they're doing those things. Next slide. And then the very last resource is an example compensatory education log. And so we provided this because we know sometimes some districts may have never done this before, and so we wanted to show you what does it look like. We would encourage you to keep these in your due process folders. And so remember that you're going to want to put the name of the provider who provided it, the content and what was covered, so any notes about the content was covered. If you look at the example, you'll notice that content is very specific, so it won't say things like reading. It says things like direct instruction and array multiplication. And so you'll see that it's much more specific, exactly what you were working on during that session, and it helps you see exactly what was covered across all of the sessions. And then you'll talk about the number of minutes. Again, those are super specific, and so, we're covering exactly how many were covered at that minute. And then, your provider can initial off that once those services were provided at the end. And then on the document itself that didn't fit in the screenshot, one of the things that is in that document as well is being an ability to total on that same page and then the overall number of minutes. And then once you're finished with it, you're going to want to stable it and put it in the student's due process folder. That way, if you're ever audited, you'll have all the information you need to show exactly what happened. So next slide. I'm going to transition it to Veronica to talk to you a little bit about the resources that were developed to provide guidance and support to parents and families.
Thanks, Sylvia. And as Sylvia said in her piece of the presentation, it's really important that families are engaged and parents are part of that ARC discussion. And we designed the guidance so that this section could easily be printed off, handed to parents prior to the meeting, so they have some opportunity to review those materials to prepare for that meaningful conversation. Next slide. So the first thing that's really important for parents to have meaningful participation is really understanding what FAPE is and special education before they can engage in those conversations around compensatory education. They need to understand what their child is entitled to and what the expectations are regarding a free and appropriate education to be meaningful members of the ARC. Rhonda, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the more that information that we share, it's really going to help that partnership. And so that we can all come to the table, because as parents or family members, we want to be able to help best and participate to the fullest in the meeting, and being able to understand not only the rights but responsibilities that come along with this, so that we understand the process. Because once we all understand it better, then we can all do our very best. And one of the biggest things I think that I've learned, whether we're talking about special education or anything, is communication. That is what is going to build a foundation. I don't care if you think back at, in your personal life, work life, all of this, when there has been good and consistent two-way communication, things will only be better. Doesn't mean we're always going to always agree, but we're able to be fully engaged, because that is what in turn is the bottom line that's going to help our children best. So understanding that we are and valued as an equal team member, and giving input. And a lot of times, and what I work with families on is, because, well, first and foremost, I have the utmost respect, because I know I would be a horrible teacher. I'm just going to tell you all that. And I understand that you're overworked and you have more than you can handle in a day, but making sure that families know that they don't have to have all of the fancy terms to understand everything, and really that communication is going to help better, so that they feel open to partner within the group. So any information and opportunities, and we're here to help with that. We've got all kinds of information that can help families, and that we'll share here in a little bit. But we're going to head on to the next slide. But any time that we can do that partnership, I think is only going to help our children, and the more prepared we are.
Okay, thanks, Rhonda. So we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into the document, and really thinking through, because of COVID-19, instructional delivery models had to shift, as all of you are aware. And I want to bring your attention to the last box there, the self-paced. It's particularly when we're talking about compensatory education and FAPE. We really want parents and districts alike to understand that, everyone was working as quickly as they could to provide the highest quality of education to students as possible. However, a self-paced model, there are some issues with the self-paced model in delivery of instruction. A district may have offered that model, but without the delivery of specially designed instruction from a special education teacher, then FAPE did not occur. So we really need to think through that piece, and this is the only place you're going to see that box in the entire document, because after this point we took that off, because if we're talking about implementation of an IEP, that if it was in a self-paced model without teacher-led specially designed instruction, then it wasn't implemented. So we're going to take that off from here on out. You're also going to see the definition of specially designed instructions for both parents and educators for the ARC to really get an understanding of that definition. Next slide, please. So talking about IEP implementation expectations in these instructional delivery models, we're going to highlight a couple of the points here. We really tried to provide parents and families with questions and answers to help guide them through that conversation around compensatory education. Next slide, please. So here we asked the question about what special education would look like in these different delivery models. The thing I want to highlight here is that some type of direct instruction from a teacher that aligns to the student's IEP had to occur. So regardless of how that instructional delivery model occurred, whether it was in person, hybrid, or through NTI, there needed to be a component of direct instruction. Rhonda, did you want to add to that as well?
Yes, and I love how you all laid it out in the document. I have to say I'm a visual person, and I love how within the chart, because a lot of questions that we get is, okay, but yeah, that now COVID, it's totally different. But regardless, the IEP has to be implemented. It doesn't matter in what means that it is. And we all know we had to adapt very quickly to be able to still provide those services. So I think everybody understanding that, and even now, since we've been in COVID for a long time, this is still a part of the work and explaining to families that we do around the state is that, and this goes back to the FAPE and educating on that, is that regardless of the delivery method, it still had to take place. So COVID didn't change that. And I think really looking at it that way and having it laid out like this just really helps everybody to understand it better. Next slide.
We're going to talk about progress monitoring. Sylvia had talked about the data that can be used in the conversation around compensatory education. I just want to say progress monitoring is always important, but during COVID, it became even more increasingly important. Teachers are not necessarily having as much access to students as they were in the past in these different delivery models. So really capturing how those students are doing. Things were so different. Things may have been, you may have been providing direct instruction, but like we just talked about, it would be in a different settings of a different way, whether that's through virtual or through phone, through other means. So really taking that progress monitoring data is really important. Rhonda, did you want to add to that as well?
Yes, and this goes back to kind of in the beginning that when we had talked about things is that families even more so now are going to have more of that data and that information that is going to be critical when we are looking at all of this. So making sure that we're getting that collected from everybody is going to be, I think, critical in really determining the compensatory education. Next slide.
So I'm just going to touch on this very briefly because it's just important for everyone to remember that supplementary aids and services and accommodations really should not change regardless of the delivery model, the instructional delivery model. Those still should have been provided to students moving forward. And very important that they still receive them, whether virtually or in person. Rhonda, did you want to add to that as well?
Yes, and we got that question quite a bit in working with families throughout that again, even though COVID hit, and regardless of the delivery method, you're still to get and have your accommodations, modifications, aids and support. Now, again, it might look a little different, but we still got to figure out you know, how to do it. And if it wasn't, then that's going to be part of looking at everything as well. Next slide.
Okay, and I just want to take a moment to highlight our partners here. A lot of the information that you will see in this document was adapted from work that came from UK's Human Development Institute, their family support partnership work, their parent involvement initiative work. They have a guidance document. It's called Kentucky Parent Guide for Special Education. They also have quick fact sheets that are both in Spanish and English, that if you are a district person, you can provide that to your parents and point them in the direction. If you are a parent, this is a place where you can go and access quick information, single page facts. And then obviously we want to talk about our partner here today. Rhonda, do you want to talk about SPIN?
Yes, and we've got the Parent Involvement Initiative. I mean, the resources that they have are just amazing and so helpful for everybody. We have a lot of things on our website too, and you can always contact me at any time. We help families one-on-one, but not only that, we work with, you know, youth or adults with disabilities, also parents, other family members, but also professionals as well. And since COVID hit, we've at least had a minimum of 2 webinars a week. And we have our video and webinar library. It's just grown by leaps and bounds. And it's not just Kentucky SPIN that presents, and it's on a whole variety of topics you can access. Our special education co-ops around the state are just amazing, and they have just as you have, just when COVID hit, everybody teams up together, and it's been wonderful. So there are a lot of the webinars that not only will be helpful for families, but maybe others too that are on there on specific topics, because we've had a lot of, and have planned for the future as well, the special ed co-ops have been our guest speakers on a variety of topics. So there's all kinds of information you can access there, and all of this is provided through our grant. So you know, the work that we do in partnering up and doing trainings, any opportunity that can help families and build that partnership and communication, we are here to help. So just let us know. Next slide now. Thank you.
So now that we've provided parents and families with an understanding of FAPE, hopefully for that first portion, we're ready to get into deeper the conversation around compensatory education. Next slide, please. So this guidance can be used in conjunction with the guidance that was developed for districts, so that this just provides parent with some reinforcement of the definitions of compensatory education. By no means are we saying don't share the entire document with them, but this is just a shortened version so that it helps them to focus in on those specific questions they may need to answer during the ARC discussion around compensatory education. We need to also remember that you'll notice the language here, it's the inability or failure to provide FAPE, because as we know, due to COVID, there are things that were just outside of our control. And that's why it's really important that we do not consider compensatory education as some form of punishment of any sort. It's a remedy, right? It's about the student for the failure of FAPE. Do you want to talk a little bit, Rhonda, about this definition?
Yes, and one of the things which we are first and foremost want to make sure that families and everybody involved have the direct information and definition of it. But what helps me, and I call this Rhonda's terminology, but when we're looking at it and to keep things separate, is that the comp ed is what you should have got that you didn't get, right? It's going to be that gap, and it's going to look very different for each individual child, not because you did not want to provide it. COVID created this, which was unavoidable. So really looking at explaining it where we can all understand, because I don't know about you all, but there's too many of the different words that everybody uses that I prefer plain language. And so really looking at it so that we make sure everybody understands what it is, and why it's so key. And this is again where it goes back, like Veronica spoke about, making sure we all have an understanding that FAPE, the free appropriate public education, is a part of the rights and entitlement for children with disabilities, so that they can understand why then, when you look at comp ed, why that is going to be so critical. And it all revolves around denial of FAPE, not because you didn't want to. And I think that's so critical. And I say that like everybody's sick of hearing that, but it is at no fault of anyone's. The pandemic created it. So we got to move on from that and make sure then everybody understands, and then everybody can come to the table to give their best and really look at the data to determine it. Next slide. So this is where also too, I always say to everybody is that it's not a given that every child's entitled to compensatory education, because a lot of times what's going to be important here is, again, it's what you didn't get that you should have got. It's that gap, right? So if it was provided through alternate means, then there's no comp ed that needs to be provided. Now, what it's going to be, and you're going to have to look on an individual basis, is where there might be that gap where you did not get what you should have got completely. And again, COVID created that. But it is not a necessary given that all children that have IEPs have that. What it is we have to take a very detailed look at what occurred, what was provided, and make those determinations on an individual basis within the ARC meetings with parent participation and input, so that we get a true picture of what occurred and what didn't occur. Next slide.
So I'm just going to highlight this very quickly. This can cause some confusion for folks around students who may reach the age of 21. As you may or may not know, FAPE entitlement of FAPE is age 3 to 21. However, if the inability or denial of FAPE occurred when the student was still eligible for FAPE, then compensatory education can be considered for a remedy by the ARC. And at the bottom of the slide, there is an OSEP letter that if you want further information about that, it does speak to graduation rate in that, or graduation in that letter, but the premise of it can be applied to multiple situations. Next slide. So Sylvia talked a lot about the decision of how compensatory education and the amount and the type and things like that. But I just want to touch on this real quickly. In her presentation, she did talk about that, but she also stressed the value of parental input. And I do want to stress that with our families as well, because the ARC, not all ARC members are going to have the information that you have as a parent, particularly about your child's schedule outside of the school day. Next slide, please. Rhonda, do you want to talk about what comp ed would look like for students?
Yes, and here's the thing: this is where, and I know Sylvia said about the thing that she always says all the time. Well, the thing I always say all the time is the if and but, right? So everything is not a blanket thing when you're looking at this, because it's individualized. So it's going to be very individualized for every student. So what may work for one student, when we're looking at this, and if we've decided that there's got to be comp ed, there is going to be no blanket solution, just as there's no blanket answer that comp ed is entitled. There's going to be no blanket solution that is what it's going to look like. Again, with parent input, we have all, I know we've all been, everything has changed so much, and everybody is at their max, right? So when we are looking at this, we need to make sure that when we structure it and provide it, that it's actually going to be something that is beneficial to the family. Like, we may want to provide all of these tons of things, but if that's not what's appropriate, making that individual determination based on what the child needs and what's appropriate for them may look very different. So it might not be that a minute for minute thing. It could be so overwhelming over top of everything that they're already handling. Again, keeping in mind that this has to be totally separate from the normal school day. So we're going to be adding this on too. So really making sure that as we do it, when we come up with the plan, that it is something that is going to help best in getting the parents' input, because they're going to be very honest about and let you know where their child's at, because we know when our children, just as you do in the classroom, it's at a point where, like, okay, that's a little too much. We got to back down a little bit. So really making sure that we do those individual determining factors, because again, there is going to be no blanket answer. There is no easy way to go about this. And not that you're looking for that, but it is going to depend just on determinant, how it looks and how it's provided is going to be individualized too. Next slide.
So very quickly, I just wanted to point out, Sylvia talked about the difference between compensatory education and extended school year services. And I just want families and parents to be clear that there may be some instances where a student would receive both, because these are very different. Compensatory ed is to remedy what happened in the past, so to speak. And ESY is so that you don't lose instruction that you have already been provided. Did you want to add anything, Rhonda?
Yeah, so I don't know if they want to hear more of Rhonda's terminology, but this is how, because a lot of times people have been getting confused, and I greatly appreciated the previous guidance that came out that explained that you all had put out about CompEd and ESY, because that helped a great deal, because people were getting it very confused, as Sylvia had explained to us earlier. CompEd is what you didn't get that you're supposed to get. ESY is so you don't lose what you got. You know, making sure that everybody understands it and keeps it very separate like that is going to help things greatly. Some kids may not qualify for either. Some will for both. Some may for one, not the other. But we got to keep them very separated. Just as Sylvia had said, as we're determining this, because they are two very different things. And I think explaining that to families as well, and what we do, trying to help families understand that these are two very separate things. Next slide. So now, because we know with when we work together, we don't always agree. Now, I can tell you that within my team that I work with, but that's the great thing, because we all bring different assets and great things to it. Now, here's what I always suggest is, because, you know, in making sure, and as I know you all do, that families understand if you all aren't in agreement. And as the school too, knowing the different procedural safeguards and the right to mediation, formal complaint, and due process. Those need to be, to me, the last resort, because we need to work together in the very beginning, because our children are still going to have to go to school, right? And we need to foster a positive partnership. No, it does not mean that we're always going to be one another's favorite person or agree, but we always suggest first starting with the school, with the teacher, with the principal. Then you look at, okay, if you're still not, you know, seeing eye to eye or not able to work it out, then get the director of special education involved with the district. But we always suggest starting that way, because first of all, things always go better when you work together in partnership, even when you disagree. But the whole bottom line with all of this, on the second bullet, we don't want anybody to have to go through any of those things, because the longer things go on, in the end, first of all, if you go all the way to the last one, nobody really wins in the end. But the thing about it is the person who loses, the further things go on, is the child. So the sooner we know, the sooner we can make a decision and get the supports and services in place, then our children are going to be doing, they'll do even better. So any way we can resolve these disputes or any areas and really working together with the few amount of steps as possible, the better, because it's only going to help our relationship with one another, but really our children are going to be more successful. Next slide.
Okay, so there's just a couple of important things to remember when you're discussing compensatory education, and we're going to go over those really quickly. Next slide. Couple of things. Compensatory education is the remedy provided to a student when a denial of FAPE has occurred. It's designed to put the student in the place they would have otherwise been in had there not been a denial of FAPE. ARCs must develop individualized plans for compensatory education and document those decisions in the conference summary. You must collect ongoing progress monitoring, and that the district is responsible for all of the costs that are associated with providing special education. Next slide. A special education teacher must provide specially designed instruction. Related service providers must provide related services. The district must provide for or pay for transportation for preschool. If the compensatory education is provided during a different session, they can't exceed a class size of 20. General services offered to all students can't take the place of required compensatory education, and districts should maintain a detailed log of all the services as they are provided to the student and maintain that in the student's due process folder. Next slide. So on this slide, you'll see that it just has the contact information for Sylvia and Veronica. And remember, you can always get a hold of Rhonda Lofton through Kentucky Spin, and that information is within the chat. And then I'm just going to transition it over to Jackie to talk us through a couple of extra questions that it looks like we have that need to be answered. Jackie?
Yes, so we do have lots of questions, and we'll try to get to some of these. One of the questions related to the word promptly. So when we're talking about scheduling compensatory education ARC meetings, what does the word promptly schedule those meetings mean?
I think that's a great question. There is not a specific timeline that promptly is, but I would encourage you to think about how you promptly schedule ARC meetings that are parent requested as a typical time when COVID is not at play. Typically, we would look for you to do it within a couple of weeks of the request that ARC is scheduled. It would be inappropriate for you to, if a parent said, hey, I want to call and discuss compensatory education, for you to wait months and months for them to have that conversation. So, think about it in terms of non-COVID. How do you promptly schedule an ARC whenever you are asked or a parent requests them? Same thing applies to compensatory education. It's the same concept. Great question.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. There's actually several questions that related to the same theme, so I just chose one of those. So if technology was provided and teacher and therapist were available for instruction, but then the student did not log on to access, is this considered non-participation and not a denial of FAPE?
So I'm gonna, go with my favorite answer of it depends. So it really is going to depend on what happened for that individual student. So if you are missing one session, it's likely non-participation. However, there's several things to consider when you're determining whether or not it was a denial of FAPE or whether it was non-participation. Have you discussed the student's attendance? Did the district make attempts to reach them? Was there an ARC scheduled to discuss how you could increase the student's attendance? Have you documented everything? Have you discussed the parents' concerns? So lots of questions that would need to be addressed to determine whether or it is or it isn't a denial of FAPE. It's not an automatic. There's a couple of things that you're really going to need to consider in that question, and it's going to vary by kid. Great question.
Okay, and then there were actually several questions that related to whether or not every ARC meeting should discuss compensatory education, even if the student consistently participated, the services were provided, and progress was made.
So I think, great question again. It's really going to be important to discuss compensatory education in every ARC, because if you're deciding that they didn't need it, you're actually making that determination outside of the context of an ARC, which is something that we really don't want to do. So I would encourage you to talk about it in every annual review and come to that determination as an ARC that there's really nothing that we need to talk about. Otherwise, you're taking that decision out of the hands of the ARC and into the hands of the district, which would be not something we would typically want to do.
And we are collecting all of these questions, even if we don't talk about yours right now, because I know we are over time. But the last question is related to funding. So whether or not IDEA funds can be used on compensatory education due to COVID, since they were not able to use IDEA funds in the past, is that allowed now just because it's COVID related?
Is Greta on here? I'm not. Greta, are you on here?
I am on. Jackie, your question, please.
So this viewer was curious to whether or not IDEA funds could be used for compensatory education that was caused due to COVID, when they weren't able to use IDEA funds in the past, but can they since it's COVID related?
There are guidelines around the use of IDEA funds for certain types of compensatory education needs, like the cost for hearing officers and things like that cannot be used. But I would encourage this person to shoot me an email over this and let's talk further about it, because there's also considerations if you're using your state and local funds that you need to understand around the maintenance of effort requirements. And so Jonathan Compton in my office is working closely with school districts right now around those MOE responsibilities and requirements, because we would much prefer to help you meet all of those tests on the front end than to try to go on the backside and try to find remedies for it. And we certainly don't want any school districts in a situation where they're paying back funds because they failed to meet their maintenance of effort. So this is a big question that's going to take a lot of untangling. So I would encourage the person to send me an email and let's get connected with the finance staff in OSIL.
Great question.
Okay, thank
Jackie,
you.
any more?
That is it for now. If you do have additional questions, then feel free to email our presenters and we will get an answer back to you as well.
Yeah, I think one of the additional questions is, can we get the slides? The slides, and the answer to that question is absolutely. And so we will get those pushed out. And then also just wanted to take a minute to thank you for attending today. We know we went a couple of minutes over, and so we are really just thankful that you were able to join us today. If you have any questions, please email myself or Veronica Sullivan or Rhonda Logston, and we will all be happy to answer any questions that you have if you think about them later. With that, we hope you have a great day and enjoy your time, and that you stay, healthy and safe.